rehabilitated, and real entertaining. This is the Carl Jackson Podcast.
All right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show podcast for this Tuesday. Be sure to please subscribe to the podcast everywhere podcasts are found: Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble. You can go to thecarljacksonshow.com, SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Follow me on Twitter, on Gitter, on Instagram, you name it, True Social, everywhere where I am on social media, The Carl Jackson Show. Guys, this is going to be a great show. I've been looking forward to this interview. We have Brian Gitt on. Brian Gitt wrote a column. This was back in June, actually, and we've just been able to book him now, but this is going to be a great show. This was a guy, if you don't mind me saying, Brian, you were a real greenie, and you had some experiences that ended up enlightening you once you started working with the government. He wrote a column for Real Clear Energy called Chasing Utopian Energy: How I Wasted 20 Years of My Life. He was given some subsidy money, if you will, to start a project from the Obama administration. We all of us remember Solyndra, all of these companies that just basically went belly up after receiving all of this money. Well, Brian Gitt was a part of that. So we're going to talk about that and how he's changed his views. So I'm looking forward to this interview, and I know you will be too. So Brian, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show podcast, first off.
Thanks, Carl. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
All right, appreciate it. Okay, so one of the things that you talked about right off the bat, obviously, I wasted 20 years of my life. That caught my eye, or how I wasted 20 years of my life in chasing utopian energy. But I loved your story. Actually, you remind me of a friend of mine that actually does travel trips in the wilderness, but he happens to lean a little more conservative. But I mean, the guy just lives off the land in Utah, Alaska, and you remind me of him in so many ways. But you start talking about this utopian energy is an imagined form of energy that's abundant, reliable, inexpensive. And you say also clean, renewable, and life-sustaining. But that's a utopian energy, or utopian energy, as you state. How did you come to that conclusion? Because you used to believe in that utopian energy.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned your friend that is very into the outdoors and the wilderness, because that's actually where this all started for me. When I was a teenager, I just fell in love with nature and spending time in the wilderness. I used to lead outdoor adventure trips for teenagers in remote Alaska. We would go mountaineering, ice climbing, whitewater rafting, all that stuff for 40 days. Like, we would be some days 10 days from a road, 10 days from a road in remote Alaska. So I had these experiences. I was immersed in the wilderness. I was working with these teenagers that were kind of being transformed by it. And that's what hooked me. That's what got me into energy. That's what got me into environmentalism. That's why I decided to dedicate over 20 years professionally of my career into that space. So I went into it for really good intentions. I wanted to have an impact. I wanted to protect these beautiful areas that I experienced and, prevent pollution, prevent all of the excesses that sometimes civilization can create. So that's the genesis of my origin story, was this love for the outdoors. That led me to energy and to buildings, because I'm a very pragmatic, practical person. And energy is a huge impact, obviously, in terms of these various environmental issues, whether it be pollution, and right now it's climate change and CO2, or water quality, all of these things. So it just seemed like a really good issue to tackle, because most of us, we go to work in buildings, we use energy every day, we, our kids go to school, all these things. It's something that we can relate to. It's something very practical. Sure. And I thought that would be a much better use of my time versus trying to, let's say, save the Amazon rainforest, and that most people don't really have a direct connection to. They don't understand, all the nuance of that. So that's kind of how I got into this, and it led me on my journey. But yeah, I was just sucked into this utopian idea. I can remember sitting in this lecture hall with Amory Lovins. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but Amory Lovins is one of the leaders of the green movement and has been for decades. And I remember him giving this lecture and him saying there's more sun that hits the earth in 1 hour than we use in the entire year. And that's a really, I was like, what?
Wow.
That's a crazy amount of energy. Like, why aren't we harnessing that? Why aren't we doing something with that? And it's these very romantic ideas. This is, it's very
Mm,
attractive, right? Like we
yeah.
want to live in harmony with nature. We don't want to, everyone wants to breathe clean air and drink clean water, right? No one wants to, have these negative side effects. So it's these romantic ideas that sucked me in. You know what it is? It's like I was getting indoctrinated into a cult. I feel like I escaped a cult. That's
Man.
and there's
Brian,
certain.
I literally did, and I described climate activists often, many of them, as it does seem like a cult to me at times, because it seems like to me, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No,
I
no,
feel like
please.
they many of them anyway derive this sense of morality and virtue from being a part of this cult. So it's just funny that you say that.
No, it's very much the case. And I think that's what I was searching for. I think most of us, we're looking for a sense of purpose, sense of
Mm,
meaning in our lives.
it's good.
And environmentalism gave me that. It gave me a set of values, it gives me a set of beliefs, and a way for me to feel virtuous, a
Wow.
way for me to gain that meaning and a sense of purpose in the way I live my life. And that's why I wanted to focus my work in that, because most of us, we got to go to work, right? Everyone's got to work.
Right.
But if you can do something that's fulfilling and gives you that sense of meaning, that's even that much better. So that's what sucked me in. And there's these core sets of dogma, right? There's these beliefs that some of them you really can't question. Right? You can't question the science today when it talks to climate change, even though that's completely antithetical to what science is. Science is about disproving hypotheses. It's not a set of beliefs. But those are some of the kind of core tenets that I was indoctrinated in. I was
Mm,
programmed for many years to believe. And when you're surrounded by other colleagues and friends that also believe these same things, it's hard to escape that. Right. And it's like a positive reinforcement loop,
right.
because not only did I believe these things, but everyone around me. I live in San Francisco, California. I
Kind of a
live in the
bubble.
Yeah, I live in the heart belly of the beast in terms of a lot of these ideas. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then, I spent over 20 years working professionally in the energy efficiency, green building, renewable energy space. So
Before we go, before we go
yeah,
there, Brian, let me
yeah.
ask you this, because one of the things that fascinated me about you and this column, and you spoke about it briefly, but I really want to know how this transition happened. So here you are, you're this wilderness guy. You talk about how you led the mountaineering expeditions in Alaska. You went on backpacking on the Rockies. I had no idea you stayed in the wilderness in Alaska for 40 days. I mean, that's I can't even imagine. One day would be an absolute trial for me, Brian. I'm not even going to lie to you. And I love the wilderness, but I'm like, all right, I can go there for, like Mount Baldy in California. Okay, let me do a 10-hour hike there. I'm done. But this fascinates me. But how did you go from this guy? Here's what fascinates me. You went from the guy climbing the mountains, and this is the mind shift that I want to understand. But you're also so pragmatic. I don't think that I often see that, where real world people like yourself that love the outdoors are able to to transform into not just, hey, I'm going to climb a mountain, to I'm going to go into the energy sector and I'm going to build a business as far as, and come up with solutions to protect the environment. So you went from I picture like a John the Baptist, guy eating locusts and wild hair and all this kind of stuff, to a guy in a suit. You know what I mean? Like that's the neat thing about your story. How did that transition happen? I get that you wanted to do something in order to clean up the environment, but that's pretty fascinating to me. I don't think that happens often in the green energy movement. Am I wrong?
Well, no, I think you're right in general. I think the things that attracted me to doing these things in the outdoors were similar in the reasons why I wanted to work in green building and energy efficiency and solar panels, because it's a very practical thing. It's not academic. Like, you have people that will go into academia or into research, and they'll spend hours or years consumed by numbers and models and projections and just surrounded by data. But it's all very cerebral. It's
Right.
working in spreadsheets. It's not actually out there installing solar panels on a house. Installing solar panels on a house is kind of like backpacking in the wilderness, right? It's very tangible. It's real. It's like atoms,
Right.
not bits, So I think that is the commonality, is that I'd like to do things that are physical, that are practical in the real world, and not just cerebral or academic.
Okay. Okay. All right. That makes perfect sense. But yeah, I was just like, man, this is so fascinating to me. Your transition. It's just like you don't hear of this much, except for Michael Schellenberger, and I have his books on my shelf, and I've read through his books, and his story is fascinating as well. One of the things that you say I found interesting in your column, you talked about seeking the fount of perfect energy allows us to pretend there aren't real world trade offs between, say, fossil fuels and helping people in impoverished nations. Will you respond to that?
All energy sources have trade-offs, every single one of them, whether we're talking about solar, wind, nuclear, coal, oil, natural gas. Everything has a trade-off. You always say you have your costs and your benefits to everything. But a lot of the proponents of wind and solar energy like to pretend that there's really no downside, that they're clean, they're abundant, they're renewable, they cost less. All of these fantasies, in a way, that aren't really grounded in reality, because they're ignoring all of the side effects. It's like if you took some medication. Medication is really useful when you're sick, right? But medication often has side effects, and you have to balance, well, are the side effects worse than the cure in this thing? And in the case of renewable energy, oftentimes the side effects are worse than the cure. And so when we start looking at, when you add up and you weigh all of the cost and benefits of every energy source, it's also different in each location. I'm sitting here in sunny California. It is going to be different to put a solar panel on my house versus if I live in Germany, or if I live in New
Sure.
York, or if I live somewhere else. Obviously, the local conditions are going to have a big bearing on whether solar makes sense, right? And you have a lot of factors like, where is it made? Oftentimes when we talk about solar, people like to ignore the fact that there's a
Right.
tremendous amount of energy, coal, all types of toxic chemicals that go into making a solar panel, not to mention the slave labor in Xinjiang, China, which is where almost all of them are made. So you have to look at all of the side effects and externalities of a particular energy source. And there's nothing that's perfect. That's when I'm referring to this utopian idea. It's grabbing people thinking that there aren't having to balance these trade-offs, when in real life there always is.
Yeah, that's a very, very fascinating point. Obviously, one of the stories that really grabbed me as well is you were by 2008. You said you started to see cracks in your beliefs, but you were rewarded. Your company was rewarded $60 million, a multi-year contract from the Obama administration. Talk to us about that a little bit, because you get all of this money. You think you're doing a world of good. You think you can help the world. And listen, you were building stuff. You have a lot of bona fides. Let me just read this real quick so the audience can hear. You say you went to work, or I went to work in construction to build energy efficient homes. I started a company that built composting systems for cities and businesses. I became executive director of an organization that championed green building policies, and you became the CEO of a consulting firm that commercialized clean energy technologies and ran energy efficiency programs. You then founded a software startup to help promote green home upgrades. Then you led business development for a company making wireless power technology. So you were no slacker at all when it came to the green energy movement. You get this $60 million contract. What happens? And
I
what was
always
the company, by the way?
Yeah, so our company was a consulting firm called BKI. We were actually acquired by a company called Frontier Energy several years later. But, the origin of this story is really interesting, because I always thought the problem was we just didn't have enough money. I always thought, hey, if
Mm,
we had enough money, these things would work and we could scale. Well, what I learned during the Recovery Act, during the 2008 recession, and then it's the Obama administration basically put billions of dollars into putting people back to work, and a big part of that money went to the energy sector, and to create jobs in the energy sector. And I was a recipient of some of that money. It flew through local governments, through the California Energy Commission and other sources. But my firm, we basically built up a whole coalition of stakeholders in California that included the investor-owned utilities like Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison. We worked with hundreds of local governments. We brought all of the contractors and kind of key building trades together, as well as other key stakeholders, to basically build this program called Energy Upgrade California. And this program was really designed to improve and weatherize the insulation and energy efficiency of thousands and thousands of homes. That was the goal. Put contractors back to work by installing all of this stuff, insulation, upgrading the heating system, upgrading the air conditioning system, all the things to make your home more energy efficient and save money on your utility bill. And what we would do is we would design new rebate programs to basically entice people to do this. We built new financing products that would draw down the cost of the interest rate. We would train contractors. We would do quality assurance in the field. We would do all of the community outreach and engagement to drive demand into the program, to basically advertise, market the program. So we had a role in all aspects of this. We were the prime contractor for a very large contract, as you mentioned, a $60 million multi-year contract. What I learned through this experience is that money doesn't solve all your problems. You actually have to have sound foundational principles that make sense, because even though we threw a ton of money at it, we had all of the right key stakeholders, everyone you'd want to have involved in this. We had support from the state level, from the local government level, from the utilities, from the contractors, but the program did not scale and the program did not work. And I think there's some fundamental flaws in the thinking that it didn't deliver enough value. What we found was the majority of the people taking advantage of all this money were actually wealthier homeowners, people that could afford these projects, number one, because a lot of times these things don't pencil economically. I mean, you're going to spend oftentimes between $10,000 and $20,000. You got to upgrade your air conditioner, upgrade your heater, put insulation throughout your house. That's not cheap. That's not, a few hundred bucks. We're talking about many thousands of dollars. Oftentimes, California is $10,000 to $20,000 oftentimes. So who has the money? Well, first of all, you got to own a house to even have, want to do these upgrades.
Such a great and simple point. Were these people virtue signaling at all, in your opinion, too?
I think it's not with these types of projects. The people that do solar I think are more virtue signaling, but these are hidden. When you put a heater in your house or a new air conditioner, most people don't see it. But a lot of times they were going to do these projects anyway, because let's say you had an old heater, right? So you had this old heater, it's been sitting there for 15 years, you need to upgrade it. Well, now the government wants to come along, give you $5,000 rebate and give you this almost zero cost financing product. And oh, by the way, they're going to help you select a contractor. It's like, okay, I'll do that. I got to replace this thing anyway. That makes sense. Even though when you actually look at the economics of it, the savings that you would gain by doing these projects don't justify the cost. Now, there's lots of good reasons to do it. Insulation is great. Everyone wants to be comfortable in their home. It gives you better sound acoustics so you don't hear the cars on the street. You want to have a great heater. You want to have a good air conditioner. So these projects, I'm not bemoaning these projects. They're good. What I'm saying the problem is that the government should not be subsidizing and giving handouts to wealthy homeowners to upgrade their homes while the middle and lower income people pay for those improvements. That doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, we weren't able to scale these programs to, in the tens of thousands that we wanted, because it took a lot of money up front to do it. And so in the economics didn't pencil. So if you're automatically narrowing the pool of people that can be interested and afford to do these projects.
Man, that is so fascinating and such a good point. You said one of the eye openers that you had is these projects were basically failing, but the government wouldn't admit it. I'm assuming when you say government, you meant the Biden administration. I mean, the Obama administration and those that were associated in doling out the money, or who are you talking about in government? and what was your initial reaction when you're seeing interviews on TV or whatever, and you're like, wait a minute, this crap didn't work, and they're saying that it did. How did you feel?
Well, when I reference the government, it's really at every level. The local governments that were on the ground helping to implement it, the state government, so the California Energy Commission and the various state energy offices that are involved, and as well as the federal government. So all three layers, because they all roll up. When we would report on the progress of the project in the program, we would report to the local governments. The local governments would report to the state and to the federal.
Gotcha.
But it all rolled up to the Obama administration. So when you hear these big claims that Obama and others on the federal level would say, those claims are based upon the work we were doing on the ground, but also the locals would talk about it as well. So it's really every level of government would be espousing these stories. And what I found disconcerting about it is because we were like the prime contractor. We were on the ground delivering these. I just wasn't seeing the results. Certainly, they were spinning success stories out of something that, to me, at best was a pretty minor result for the level of investment. I mean, again, it's all related to how much money you're putting in. Yeah, you're going to get some results. Obviously, if you're going to throw hundreds of millions or billions of dollars at something, you're going to get some people to upgrade their homes, but you're not going to get the scale that was anticipated or hoped for.
Now, also, was there any way to measure if these projects were doing anything to help at all with the environment? We talked about solar panels. I think of the materials that have to be mined and using child labor and so on for solar panels. The same is true with EV batteries. I mean, did you obviously you mentioned some solutions in the column that I want to get to shortly here, but was there any way of measuring a level of success for actually helping the environment?
Well, so that particular program was more narrowly focused on energy efficiency in buildings.
I got you.
But I've been very involved in promoting solar and electric vehicles and these other technologies, and I can say that oftentimes those trade-offs are not acknowledged and they're not talked about. It's interesting. You hear this little acronym all the time, ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. This is kind of a buzzword that's entered the common political speak these days and in the finance community. And what that means, it's a set of criteria or which a company incorporates these ideas into their capital investments. So if they're going to improve their buildings or improve their auto fleet, or they're going to do all these various things to make their company more green, basically, and socially responsible. And what's ironic about it is they totally ignore, again, a lot of the negative externalities, a lot of the side effects. So you'd think that a company that's one to virtue signaling about how great they are and how socially responsible they are wouldn't want to buy a product that is made by literal slaves today. I mean, that's kind of an important thing. But the reality is solar grade polysilicon, 45% of all of the solar grade polysilicon in the world is produced in one province in China, which is known to use. There's millions of enslaved Uyghurs, which are a group of Muslims in China that are basically forcibly imprisoned in these internment camps, forced to work in the factories and involved in this. And even the Obama administration has passed legislation that prohibits the import of certain components from this province. So this isn't even a left or right thing. Everyone has acknowledged this is a real problem. China has interned and enslaving this Uyghur population. And we know that solar panels are the components that make them up are a huge component of what a lot of those people are doing in terms of the work. So to me, I don't know how that's ESG. How is that socially responsible, much less the environmental impacts? Because when you make things in China, these are incredibly energy intensive technologies. To make a silicon cell, you use a ton of coal. And China doesn't have the environmental regulations that the United States or Canada or some of our allies has. They don't have those kind of restrictions. So basically, we're exporting all of this emissions to a developing country that doesn't have the requirements, that doesn't have the regulations that we have, and is using actual slaves to help develop the product. To me, I don't even understand how that could possibly be considered environmental, social product.
Oh my God. I hope you become a spokesman for people of common sense in Washington, D.C. to speak. Have they invited you to Washington, D.C. by chance? Anyone, Republicans, Democrats, anyone to speak out against this? And I mean, the trade offs. I think that's such an important word. Trade offs. It's like we live in this fairy tale world. Well, listen, we can go clean or green, so to speak. But honestly, I don't think people should be forced to do it. And just like you said, I don't think it should be subsidized. If people want to feel virtuous, or if people want, or just simply. They want a more efficient way of cooling and heating their homes. So be it. By all means, do it. But understand that there are trade-offs. Don't make it a moral issue. It should just be a free market issue, in my opinion. And if people want to buy into it and all that kind of stuff, I really don't care. But I do care when they force this agenda on me, and then without understanding the trade-offs, and they virtue signal about it when I know that, given the stuff that you've just mentioned, from the slavery to the material and the lack of regulations that China has, I'm like, this is a joke. You guys are. I mean, it just frustrates me to no end. So I think that's just me kind of ranting, Brian. But
yeah, no, I think you're spot on that. And what I'd like to do is let's zoom out for a second. What's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? Because I think most of us can agree on the goal. The goal is we're trying to protect and improve the quality of human lives, and we're trying to protect and improve the quality of the environment. I mean, I think most of us, if we sat around the kitchen table, we could agree that that's what we're shooting for. That's what we're aiming at. So then anytime you have a goal, it's useful to have criteria for how you evaluate different technologies, investments, opportunities, right? And so there's a set of criteria that I think are really important when you're starting to assess these different energy options, whether they be solar, wind, coal, anything. The first one is energy security. If you don't have energy security, you don't have a country. Right, you're seeing this right now. This crisis in Europe, specifically in Germany, because they're dependent on Russia for their natural gas, and their whole industrial sector is in the process of having to shut down and ration because they don't have enough energy, and that's going to have massive ripple effects on their economy. So if
when you say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say energy security, you mean national security, or fossil fuels. Is that what you're talking about?
What I mean is you need to have available access to energy. And if you're dependent on an adversarial country for the components or your energy, such as Germany is reliant on Russia. That's a weakness on their national security because they're depending on energy. If we go and we build our whole energy system around wind turbines and solar panels, we will be dependent on China because China manufactures almost all of it. And so that doesn't make any sense. They're an adversarial country, right? So you got to have a domestic supplier of energy, or at least close friends and allies that can provide it. So that's what I mean by energy security, having that accessible and available. The second thing is affordability. If it's so expensive, you're not going to have companies being able to produce and manufacture things. You're not going to have people be able to afford the energy. They're going to basically live in some level of energy poverty. You know, what's interesting, it's not interesting, it's really the real catastrophe, the real alarmism that is focused on climate right now should be focused on that we have 3 billion people in the world that live in some level of energy poverty. That's 40% of every human, all the humans on Earth. And when we're talking about developing countries, we're talking about not having enough energy that they can have all the modern conveniences of life. I mean, we live in this amazing country, the United States, where we have this level of prosperity and freedom to basically, you know, have air conditioning, have heating, have refrigeration, have vaccines be refrigerated, have these X-ray machines when we go to the hospital, all this stuff we take for granted. But most of the world doesn't have that. These 3 billion people barely have enough energy to power an American refrigerator. And about just shy of 1 billion of them have zero. No electricity, no type of heating or cooking fuel. They spend women often spend 2 hours a day gathering wood for cooking or water for cooking, right? So that's what 3 billion people, the real catastrophe I see today.
That honestly, that's a great way to bring it into focus and help us to see that from a personal standpoint. So basically, fossil fuels that people seem to hate, so many people in America, are responsible for giving us a lavish lifestyle compared to those 3 billion people that you're talking about. I love that term, energy poverty. Is that what you're saying? Is that a correct way to frame it?
Fossil fuels has benefited humankind more than anything else in human history. I mean, when you look at every societal metric, you look at lifespan, how long are we living, infant mortality, various metrics around economic opportunity, all of these various health and societal impacts. As countries and cultures embrace fossil fuels, life improves and gets better. That doesn't mean they're perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't side effects. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't address those. But it's an absolute fact. There's no way that any serious person could look at the data and tell me that fossil fuels aren't an amazing benefit to human flourishing and overall quality of life.
Man,
so
that's
another one. There's a few more. I don't need to go through them all, but there's all of these factors that you have to look at. You have to look at emissions. You got to look at how scalable something is. Is it available everywhere? Like when we talk about solar and wind, well, they're only usually available in areas where you have lots of wind and lots of sun. That's not going to be everywhere. So is that really scalable? And they're not going to be powering a lot of our transportation, our heavy trucks, our ships, our planes. I mean, where's that energy going to come from? Much less. About 20% of all of the fossil fuel or of all the oil goes into making stuff. The computer that I'm sitting here talking to you in, the coffee mug that I'm holding, the desk I'm sitting at, the chair I'm in, that is made from hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, right? You're not going to make these materials, all these things in our life, from solar and wind.
Man, such a fascinating point. So you're saying that Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and a lot of these protesters would be running around butt naked if they weren't. I mean, obviously they would have nothing. That's just me talking. But man, that's fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. Okay, a couple of things. You talk about some solutions, and then I want to talk about a few of your principles. You outline 8 principles in this column, and then I want to close with you've recently visited the Netherlands. Obviously, there's a major issue happening there, where the I forget the name of the president or premier or whatever he's called in the Netherlands, but you have Dutch farmers blocking the roads, or at least they were. I haven't kept up with it within the last couple of weeks, but it was a serious crisis. We've seen what's happened in Sri Lanka, and now Dutch farmers are, I mean, many of them are being told to give up, 95% of their cattle. I mean, it's absolutely insane to try to fit into these governmental regulations on climate change and all this kind of stuff. It's insane. So I want to get your take on that. But first, you talk about some real world solutions. You said, I used to think solar and wind power were the best ways to reduce CO2 emissions, but the biggest reduction in CO2 emissions during the past 15 years, over 60%, as a matter of fact, has come from switching from coal to natural gas. Your response?
Correct. It's a kind of inconvenient truth for a lot of the proponents of solar and wind that when you look at the United States has basically saved over 1 billion tons of CO2 over the last 15 years. A huge amount, more than any other country. We've reduced our emissions in overall magnitude, more than the entire continent of Europe. So when we look at, well, how do we do it? What was actually the catalyst? What caused this significant reduction in CO2 emissions? It was the switching from coal to natural gas. Natural gas has about 50% of the CO2 emissions is burning coal, and only 10% of the air pollutants. It's an incredibly clean way to produce energy, and the United States is blessed with tremendous resources in terms of oil and natural gas. And so when the shale revolution happened, when there's a breakthrough in new drilling technology in the early 2000s, we were able to access just this whole new massive reserve of natural gas. It drove the cost way down for consumers. So not only large industry like chemical companies and manufacturers paid a lot less for energy, but all of the families in the US actually benefited immensely from having low cost energy for the last 15 years, while decreasing the amount of CO2 emissions, because that 60% number, so 60% of all of that billion tons of CO2 that we saved was due to that coal to natural gas switching. Only 9% was due to solar. Only 9. So when you look at what is the most effective way, right? That's right. When we get lost in these conversations about trying to pick winners in technology, it's like, okay, if the goal is to reduce emissions, let's choose the thing that actually it does the best
Reduces
job, right?
emissions,
Right.
right.
Let's do the most cost-effective thing that actually achieves it. So I think that's a great story that oftentimes gets glossed over. People try to vilify fossil fuels, say that natural gas is evil and is terrible. Well, natural gas is responsible for the majority of our emissions reductions.
Man, fascinating. And I'm always concerned about this. I'm always concerned about this, Brian. I'm like, I'm a human being. You're a human being. Obviously, we breathe out. We breathe out CO2. We need CO2 for photosynthesis. So I'm always kind of concerned that maybe some of the climate activists believe the solution is to kill off people. I mean, that may sound a little far fetched, but I do wonder that, to be honest with you.
Well, I think there definitely is a strain of individuals that believe in what's called degrowth. And when you talk about degrowth, what you're in essence saying is shrinking the pie, shrinking the amount of people, because we need to. All life needs to grow. If you're basically limiting opportunities, if you're limiting growth, we know history is riddled full of this. You're going to create violence. To me, degrowth equals violence because you have fewer people fighting over a shrinking pie, basically.
Right.
And that's not going to lead to human flourishing. That's not going to lead to more people living a better quality of life. And it's totally unnecessary. It's ignoring the fact that I alluded to earlier, that 4 out of 10 people on the planet are already living in energy poverty, right? We want to get them more energy, not less.
Right.
So
Right.
It is an incredibly pessimistic view on
That's
the
a great
world.
point.
And it is actually just, it's anti-human. That's what it is. It's an anti-human mindset, and it's this almost religious belief, and that the earth is this kind of what Alex Epstein calls this delicate nurture. It's almost this thing that we need to protect at all costs, even at the expense of human suffering.
Man, that's such a great point when you already have, like you said, nearly 4 billion people living in energy poverty. I mean, I didn't even put two and two together. Okay, another thing that you mentioned quickly, and then I want you to talk about your eight principles and give us your experiences while you were traveling through the Netherlands. But you said, I used to believe nuclear energy was dangerous and nuclear waste was a big problem. But in fact, nuclear is the safest and most reliable way to generate low emission electricity, and it provides the best chance of reducing CO2 emissions. When you hear nuclear, I mean, I used to be this way. I'm like, are you crazy? I mean, nuclear bombs and all this kind of stuff. We're going to work with nuclear, but it is the cleanest. It is the cleanest energy source, is it not?
It is by far. And you look at the data and the history, we have 70 years of commercial operation of nuclear power reactors around the world. And most people don't realize this. In the United States, 20% of all of our electricity comes from nuclear power. Over 100 million Americans live within 50 miles or work within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant. So they're all over the place, right? And we've been powering most of our society, at least 20%. From nuclear for many years. How many people have died in the U.S. as a result of this? Zero, none, nil. We only had one accident. All accidents are terrible. It was 3 Mile Island. But we have many industrial accidents with things all the time. But no one died in it. No one was exposed to radiation, and no one got sick. So what are we even talking about? We all the time, you don't hear about all the chemical explosions in a chemical plant or all of these other things, that happen. Unfortunately, life is not perfect. We're going to always have accidents and problems. But the reality is nuclear has not had any significant negative impact in the U.S. at all. And even globally, when we look at the entire world, over the last 70 years, we've had those 3 accidents. We had Chernobyl, we had Fukushima in Japan, and then we had 3 Mile Island in the U.S. Out of all of those, 200 deaths have been attributed, and all of that is just Chernobyl, which the way the Soviet Union ran that reactor would never happen in any other country today. And the reality is, it was mostly all the first responders and the people that were responding to the emergency. So it has been blown way out of proportion. People are using fear. They're weaponizing fear to scare people for their political aims. That's what's happening. And the same reason some people think flying is more dangerous than driving, right? It's an emotional response. It's an emotional reaction. When you look at the data, we know it's much safer statistically to fly in an airplane than to drive in a car. Well, nuclear power is very similar. People have this innate fear of it because they've been pumped full of all of this dogma and kind of false ideas about it, but it's just not true. Statistically, it is the safest form of energy because millions of people die every year from coal pollution, basically air pollution that's causing respiratory problems due to coal emissions, right? I don't see people screaming from the rooftops, we should shut down every coal plant tomorrow because that's what powers most of the world, right? So it just doesn't make any sense from an actual data and statistical point of view.
Talk about such a great point. You know what, Brian, I got to tell you, when I read this column, I said, and I had stood in for Mike Gallagher at the time, nationally syndicated radio host Mike Gallagher. And I went through some of your column with the audience, and even the producer was like, hey, send me a link to that column. That's probably one of the clearest written. Seriously, you did such a great job of outlining in such a short, a short column. You did a great job of outlining your points. I mean, it was really clear. It's hard to write that well. So I give you tons of credit for making your points very clear in a column.
Thank you. I appreciate it. If people are interested in reading kind of other things that I write, I have a website, briangitt.com, that people can find other articles, and they can also follow me on Twitter because I'm very active on Twitter. A lot of the facts and the things we're talking about today, I try to put out there to educate people. That they can find me at Brian Gitt on Twitter. So those are some good places. If people are interested in finding more resources, they can find me.
Okay, I'll make sure to follow you, and we'll definitely post this in the podcast, a link to it, so people can go right to your website. So talk about some of the 8 principles. You talk about security, reliability, affordability, just what you want to talk about in the next few minutes or so, which are some of the most maybe prominent principles that you would speak on.
Sure. Well, I mentioned some of them earlier, like energy security, affordability, scalability, but let's talk about a couple others that we haven't hit. So land use. Let's talk about land use as an example. So when you're applying a criteria to decide which energy source you should do, you got to look at how much land does it take up. So let's use an example here. I'm sitting in California. So California has one last remaining nuclear power plant. It's called Diablo Canyon. It produces about 8% of all of the electricity in the state. So it's a huge amount of the power that we use. They're wanting to prematurely shut it down, not because there's any safety issue, not because there's any problem, even though it produces 15% of all of the clean energy in the state because it has no emissions, right? It's the cleanest source of energy. But so to replace that, if they end up shutting it down, which hopefully we can fight them off and prevent this, but as of now, it's slated to close in 2025. But if you were to replace that one power plant that basically sits on 120 acres of the actual physical footprint of the plant, the entire area, I'm talking about all the area around it, that they own the land, but they're not really doing anything on it. That's just shy of 1,000 acres for the whole footprint of this thing. Now, if you're going to replace that 1,000 acres with, let's say, solar panels, you would need 90,000 acres, 90,000. So a 90 times increase in land use to generate the same amount of power. Now, where is all that land? Who's going to, know when you start building all this, these solar farms, you also need to then build transmission lines because you got to bring that solar energy that's usually far away from where the homes and businesses are to those homes and businesses. So not only do you need the land for all those 90,000 acres for all those solar panels, but now you need to build transmission lines for them. Now, most people don't like transmission lines going through their backyard.
Sure.
You have huge land use conflicts. This is one of the things that the environmental movement, I think, is really underestimated that's happening throughout rural America today, is no one wants to live next to a wind farm. No one wants to live next to a solar farm. The wind farms are loud. They're visually unappealing, and they impact property values negatively. So there's a lot of very valid reasons people don't want to live near them. Well, if you're going to start taking up that amount of land, we're not talking about a small footprint. So when you talk about a technology like nuclear, natural gas, the equivalent, like a natural gas power plant, could fit on a single city block that a wind farm, takes 13 square miles to fill up. So these technologies are incredibly resource intensive and land intensive, and these are really important factors to consider, even from an environmental standpoint. If you're going to select a technology, because clearly natural gas and nuclear, from my perspective, are way more environmentally beneficial than solar and wind power. When you really weigh all of the various criteria, you weigh energy security, affordability, scalability, emissions, land use, lifespan, all of these things. Yeah, that's another thing, lifespan, right? So a nuclear plant can operate for 60 to 80 years, sometimes
Okay.
even longer if it's well maintained. Solar panels and wind turbines, basically you got to throw them away every 20 to 25 years. And for wind turbines, after about 16 years, there's so much maintenance on them that oftentimes they don't even make sense to continue to operate. So 20 years is being generous on wind
Wow.
turbines specifically. So you have to consider all of these criteria
Not
when
to
you're
mention,
making
how do you dispose of them
they get
without
tossed in the
damaging the
landfill.
environment?
Right. Well, that's the reality, is that you have the wind turbine blades are not recyclable. They're massive. These things are hundreds of feet long, and they ultimately get dumped in landfills today. People talk about solar panels being recycled, but they're not. Right now they're too expensive. If you were to recycle these solar panels, first of all, we don't have the infrastructure to do it in the United States today. But even if you were to force that infrastructure to be built, the cost would be so high that the cost of the solar panels would be astronomical and you wouldn't sell them. So these factors are real impediments to the scalability of these technologies.
Man, fascinating. Good stuff. Okay, so lastly here, talk to us. You were able to go to the Netherlands, obviously, in the height of during the height of the protest with the Dutch farmers out there. Talk to us about what you saw, what you were able to. I think you went out there to consult with some people. Correct me if I'm wrong. So tell us what you saw. Tell us what you were able to do.
Yeah, I had a great opportunity. Michael Schellenberg invited me to tag along with him and go to some of these meetings and visit the Netherlands and also go to Germany to find out what's happening there. So when we were in the Netherlands, we basically went out and started just talking to people. We went out to visit with the farmers. We spent 2 days driving all around the country, meeting with multiple farmers, dairy farms, various agricultural operations. But we also talked to biologists. We talked to political and elected officials to try to understand what's actually happening there, because there's this
Sure.
nitrogen requirement that is limiting the amount of nitrogen pollution that can be emitted from a property, from an agricultural farm. Now, when we think about industrial agriculture, at least when I think about it in the United States, I think about thousands of cows, maybe 10,000 cows on a dairy, or I think about these massive fields that are getting applied fertilizer to. That's kind of industrial agriculture I think about. In the Netherlands, the scale is just completely different. What they call an industrial farm is like 150 to 200 head of cows on the
Wow.
dairy farm. Like that's a
Okay.
large one, right? So what we're really talking about is small family farms. Ultimately, if we're going to have an apples and apples comparison, these are some of the most efficient farmers on planet Earth. They've been doing this for hundreds of years in their family. They basically reclaimed the sea. So a lot of the farmland used to be underwater, used to be under the sea. They,
Okay.
through ingenuity and innovation, they basically were able to get all the water pumped out. They reclaimed that land, then they farmed it, and then over hundreds of years, sometimes they left that land to go basically find more fertile ground. So that land, when they left it, nature came back, right? It
Right.
did its thing, came back, and that in a lot of the areas, that is what they're trying to protect. They're trying to protect this farmland, this nature area, protected nature area that used to be under the sea, that then was farmland, that then became nature. Right. And there's a whole patchwork of these throughout the country. It's not like Yellowstone or Yosemite or one of these amazing, like huge wilderness areas.
Sure.
We're talking about a patchwork of small amounts of land all throughout the country, and a lot of it that used to be almost degraded farmland. Right. So that's
Unbelievable.
the land they're trying to protect from this. And that's the scale of what we're talking about in terms of these operations. Farmers are incredibly frugal. They're incredibly disciplined. They don't want to waste anything. I mean, anyone that's ever met a
Right.
farmer knows they're not going out to waste fertilizer, or apply extra fertilizer, or dump manure excessively. They use everything, all the inputs in a very frugal way. So they're not over applying this stuff just to dump it, right? Because it costs money. It's very expensive. Fertilizer is an incredibly expensive input for these agricultural operations. So it just doesn't make any sense why they're cracking down on farmers, especially in the time when we're facing a global food famine in certain areas of the Middle East and North Africa. Like, why are we trying to cram down on these relatively small operations for a requirement to protect areas that used to be under the ocean or under the sea?
I didn't even know that. That's fascinating to learn. So this makes this story even more just real and honestly harsh to me, what the government is doing in the Netherlands. So that's very fascinating. Brian, I got to tell you, man, I was looking forward to this interview just based off of your column. And this went even better than I expected. I appreciate your knowledge, your clarity. And again, tell the people what you're up to today. And then also, again, share your information where people can find you on social media and website and all that kind of good stuff. And guys, if you're listening to this podcast, please be sure to subscribe, share it with your friends, thecarljacksonshow.com, SalemPodcastNetwork.com, anywhere podcasts are found. And again, find me on social media, The Carl Jackson Show. But I want you to follow this guy, Brian Gitt. Honestly, I've read tons of columns when it comes to energy and green energy, but this is one of the clearest columns that Brian, I've ever read. You just made it so simple and easy for a lumnut like me to be able to understand, and I appreciate that. So anyway, where can people find you, Brian, and what are you up to today?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I mean, my mission is really to change the narrative around energy. I think energy is the foundation of civilization and all of human progress, and we can't afford to go backwards. And so I think we need to push back against a lot of these bad ideas that are being put out there in bad policies, restricting infrastructure development. We need to invest in our infrastructure, and we need to invest locally, domestically in the US. So I want to change that narrative, and I want to get more stuff built. Ultimately, that's my mission. People can find me at Brian Gitt, just as my first and last name, on Twitter, or go to my website, briangitt.com, to find long form articles, writing, subscribe to my newsletter that I put up periodically just with the various articles. And I really appreciate the opportunity to chat today. This is a lot of fun.
All right. I appreciate you, man. And again, you spell his last name Gitt. So that's very important. Brian, Brian, not with a Y, and then Gitt, Gitt. So briangitt.com and at Brian Gitt on Twitter. Brian, it's been a pleasure. This has been a fun, enlightening interview for me. I look forward to speaking with you in the future. And when I'm sitting in for one of these national hosts, I'm gonna get you on so that more people can learn about you and what you're up to, because I do think it's very important to be able to change the narrative. And listen, I'm all for clean energy. Sounds great. But we shouldn't be virtue signaling about it. I think there should be the freedom of choice when it comes to this thing. And we should be efficient. We should be efficient and honest with people. And when you talked about the 3 billion or 4 billion approximately people that are deprived of the energy resources that we use, that have created a better life for those of us that are in the West, I just feel like it's morally wrong to deprive people of the things that have made us a better society and a healthier society, frankly. So I appreciate what you're doing, man. I really do.
Thank you, Carl. I enjoyed our conversation. Love to come back at some point. Thank you.
All right. Absolutely. Okay, guys. So please be sure again to subscribe to the podcast everywhere podcasts are found. TheCarlJacksonShow.com, SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Apple, Google, Spotify, you name it. Anywhere where you find podcasts, you can find us there. Also, The Carl Jackson Show on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Getter, True Social, wherever I am on social media, you can do that. And please be sure to take advantage of our special, or our listener special, at mypillow.com. Go to mypillow.com. You can use the promo code Carl just CARL. Use the promo code Carl. You can take advantage of the Percale sheets that are on discount, but once the supplies are gone, they're gone. So right now, like a queen set normally sells for $89.98. They're now $39.98. But that promo code applies to all sizes, and also it applies to anything on the website that's on special. Use that promo code Carl. Get your discounts there, and you'll be helping American jobs, American manufacturing, and hopefully Brian Gitt will get some materials there. You can use the promo code Carl, Brian. Get your stuff get yourself some nice stuff on sale. So anyway, guys, I appreciate you tuning in to this podcast. Please be sure to share this information with Brian Gitt. I think this is so crucial. I think it's so important. So we appreciate him being on. And until next time, guys, don't grow weary doing good. God bless you.